Prince William is not an impulsive man. That's what makes this so serious. For years, he's handled royal business the way the institution prefers. Slow reviews, careful wording, endless meetings, decisions that take so long you almost forget what started them. This time, he didn't do that. This time, he acted within hours, behind a closed door at Windsor, after his daughter Charlotte ended up shaking in a corridor, repeating a sentence that made him realize the fight she'd just been dragged into was carrying the weight of an adult war she never started. The girl on the other side of that confrontation wasn't a random cousin from the far end of the family tree. It was Camilla's granddaughter, Lady Amelia, a young woman who, right up until that afternoon, held an honorary palace role, designed specifically so she could stand near William's children at family events and appear in official photographs. That role is gone. William removed it, and the speed at which he did it is the clearest signal yet that he believes the line between his children and adult bitterness is not negotiable. On the surface, what happened at Windsor looks like something that could be filed under teenage drama. Two young women in a corridor, harsh words, wounded pride, jealousy, a shove. That's the kind of story families usually bury. But when William sat down with the written account prepared by a senior aide and read what Amelia had actually said to Charlotte before pushing her, the corridor fight stopped being the main event. It became the final crack in a foundation that had already been weakened weeks earlier, in a different house, at a different table. Charlotte's description of the confrontation was simple and devastating. It was a planned Windsor weekend. Charles, Camilla, William, Catherine, George, Charlotte, Louis, and selected relatives all under one roof. Amelia was there because of her honorary designation, the young royal companion role that allowed her to appear beside William's children during certain engagements. Somewhere between a staircase and a doorway, Charlotte and Amelia collided into an argument. Charlotte, hurt and angry, threw a cruel line that a borrowed palace title didn't make Amelia royal. She regretted it almost instantly, but before anyone shoved anyone, Amelia delivered a sentence that changed everything. She claimed that William wanted Camilla's entire side of the family pushed out of royal life once Charles is no longer king. Not William wants the monarchy slimmed down. Not William has concerns about structure. The message Amelia had been carrying was absolute and personal. When Charles goes, your father wants my family gone. Charlotte answered that immediately. That isn't what my father said. It's a simple response, but it matters, because it marks the exact second doubt entered the room. Amelia heard Charlotte contradict the story. For a heartbeat, she recognized the possibility that the words she'd been holding onto for weeks might not be accurate. Any hope of this being just misinformation could have lived in that pause. But she didn't stop. She pushed Charlotte anyway. That's the detail that turned a bad argument into a line William refused to let pass. It wasn't just that his daughter had been pushed. It was that the push came after Amelia had heard, in Charlotte's own voice, that the information she was acting on might be wrong, and chose to use it anyway. That combination of adult words and teenage choice is exactly what made him decide the problem wasn't the corridor. It was the pipeline that had filled that corridor with someone else's resentment. When William asked who had first put those words in Amelia's mouth, who had described his intentions in a way harsh enough to make a teenage girl believe he wanted to erase an entire branch of the family, the room went quiet. Nobody answered. Silence inside a palace room like that doesn't mean we truly don't know. It usually means we know, and we're terrified of what happens when we say it out loud. William understood what that silence was telling him. This wasn't teenage gossip. It was an adult sentence that had escaped, traveled, warped, and landed on the wrong shoulders. Context matters here. Windsor that weekend was supposed to be a symbol of unity. A private gathering with Charles as king and father, Camilla as queen and grandmother, William and Catherine as future monarchs and parents. Their three children navigating a life that is both ordinary and anything but. Amelia wasn't just another guest. She was inside the orbit, pulled there on purpose by an honorary role that had been invented specifically to give her a defined place around William's young family. That role, the young royal companion designation, is easy to misunderstand from the outside. It sounds like a title, it looks official. There's a pin, instructions, and clear visibility attached to it. But underneath the symbolism, it is nothing more than a palace tool. It isn't a peerage, it isn't a legal honor. It's a discretionary privilege created by courtiers, approved by senior royals, and tied entirely to one thing, being allowed to stand in certain places at certain times. Which also means it can be taken away just as quickly, by the same household that created it, without lawyers or parliament or constitutional drama. That's why William could move fast. He didn't need a committee to decide this for him. He needed to decide whether a young woman who had turned his supposed words into ammunition against his daughter still belonged inside the ceremonial bubble around his children. While Catherine was sitting with Charlotte behind a closed door, forcing her to face the fact that she'd said something cruel even in self-defense, William was already sitting in his office, pen in hand, looking at an internal removal order. The way Catherine handled Charlotte in those minutes says almost as much about this story as anything William did. She didn't just tell her daughter, "You were right to be upset." She told her that what had happened to her was serious, but that didn't erase what she herself had chosen to say. Charlotte admitted that the line about Amelia's borrowed title not making her royal had come out of her mouth in anger, and that she'd regretted it almost immediately. Catherine didn't let that slide. She made it clear that defending yourself is one thing, letting someone else's bitterness turn you cruel is another. That is not the kind of parenting that encourages a child to wrap themselves in victimhood. It is the kind that teaches them that being hurt does not automatically make you innocent. And it is exactly the kind of parenting William was echoing on the institutional side. Protect, but don't pretend nobody on your own side was capable of harm. But while Catherine was dealing with Charlotte's choices, William had to deal with something else entirely. The adult choices that had built the situation. He asked one focused question. Did Amelia put her hands on Charlotte first? Yes. Did she repeat a sentence about his intentions toward Camilla's family that matched distortions he'd already heard whispered outside his presence? Yes. Had anyone in the room been willing to admit where that sentence started? No. He signed the order. Camilla's initial reaction wasn't about structures or legalities. It was about fairness and love. In her mind, Amelia had done something wrong, but she was still fundamentally a child. From her perspective, this should have been handled as a private wound inside a private family. A brutal conversation, some enforced distance, maybe a short-term removal from a few engagements. Stripping the designation completely and barring Amelia from ceremonial appearances alongside George, Charlotte, and Louis felt, to Camilla, like turning one ugly incident into a permanent stain. There is pain in that argument that's hard to dismiss. Amelia is a young woman who had been encouraged to believe she belonged, at least partly, inside royal life. To see that belonging evaporate within hours would hurt anybody. But William had already moved past the level where this could be framed as one incident. He knew, because he'd been sitting at the table where it started, that the real story began 3 weeks earlier at Clarence's house, in a room where nobody under 18 was supposed to carry anything out with them. Charles had gathered a small group, Camilla, William, Catherine, a handful of relatives and senior aides, to discuss who would appear where during an upcoming summer ceremony. Somewhere on the agenda, amid seating charts and processional plans, there was the suggestion that ceremonial positions for relatives like Amelia could be expanded. In simple terms, people with no constitutional duties could be given more consistent visibility, standing near the core family more often. On paper, it was a practical idea. In practice, it touched every nerve William has about what a monarchy becomes when too many people are allowed to orbit it with half-defined roles. He pushed back, not at Amelia as a person, but at the concept. He asked whether temporary family privileges were slowly becoming permanent expectations, whether roles like Amelia's would, over time, blur the line between this person speaks for the crown and this person is simply related to someone who does. From his point of view, the argument was structural. From Camilla's, it felt personal before he'd finished the sentence. She heard a future king quietly tightening the circle around his 3 children and, by extension, their direct line, drawing an invisible ring around his side of the family and leaving her grandchildren on the outside. The idea that William was clearing the future court before he even inherits it wasn't written in any memo that day, but it began to form in Camilla's head as the only way to describe what she felt. William insisted bloodline wasn't the issue. He said the monarchy couldn't afford another generation of semi-royals and half-royals confusing the public. Working royals needed to be clearly defined. The structure had to be slim, clear, and honest. It's the same logic his father has outlined publicly for years. But structure talks don't land in a vacuum when the people around the table already feel the weight of their own histories. Camilla, a woman who spent decades being painted as an intruder before she became queen, has lived a long life of being told she doesn't fully belong. Hearing about boundaries and roles from the man who will one day replace her husband wasn't going to land gently. Everything became sharper when she brought George, Charlotte, and Louis into the discussion. She suggested, in effect, that William's children were being treated as if no other young relatives counted. That shift put his family directly on the table. He turned cold. He pushed his chair back and said very carefully that his children were not bargaining pieces in arguments about palace stair plans. Charles said nothing, and in families like this, silence is a decision. It told Camilla that, in that moment, she stood alone in how she felt. She left that dinner not just frustrated, but diminished. Later that night, in a private room, she vented to an aide she trusted. She put the feeling into a sentence. William is clearing the future court before he even inherits it. In her mind, that line stayed between herself and someone paid to listen, someone who understood the difference between blowing off steam and issuing policy. But words inside royal houses are like smoke. If you don't trap them immediately, they slip under doors you never meant to open. The aide later admitted, in writing, that the remark was repeated days afterward within earshot of others. It wasn't repeated exactly. It never is. The edges sharpened as it moved. By the time Amelia overheard her version, it had transformed into something more brutal. William wants Camilla's family gone when Charles is gone. One line expresses fear about boundaries. The other expresses certainty about rejection. Amelia didn't hear nuance. She heard her grandmother's frustration simplified and hardened into a sentence that sounded like a verdict. She carried that verdict with her, into days, into weeks, into quiet corners where she watched Charlotte laugh and talk and stand where she herself stood only when invited. Resentment doesn't arrive as a fully formed weapon. It builds. Every time Amelia was given a neatly folded outfit and told where to stand, that sentence echoing in her mind made the position feel more temporary. Every time she saw Charlotte turn up somewhere automatically, because Charlotte is not invited into royal spaces, she is born into them, the feeling deepened. This is theirs, and I'm here until someone changes their mind. When she walked down that Windsor corridor and saw Charlotte alone, she wasn't just seeing a cousin. She was seeing the living embodiment of the future court she'd been told might not have room for her side of the family. She wasn't just angry at Charlotte, she was angry at the father whose name had been attached to her insecurity. So she did what furious, frightened young people have done in every family for as long as families have existed. She turned a rumor into a weapon and used it on the wrong person. By the time William connected the corridor confrontation back to the Clarence house dinner, the story's shape was undeniable. This wasn't Amelia lost her temper. It was adult frustration left a room it should have stayed in, grew teeth, and bit a child. When he sat opposite Camilla in a private sitting room, there were no buffers. She wanted Amelia's title restored, at least temporarily, arguing that one bad argument shouldn't define an entire future. He wanted to know how a girl from her household came to believe that his intentions were so hostile she could repeat them to his daughter and feel justified in the confrontation that followed. He slid the aide's account toward her. He pointed out that Charlotte had already faced consequences for what she'd said, had already been told that cruel lines were not acceptable, even under attack. He separated Charlotte's cruelty from Amelia's. Charlotte had spoken a hard truth badly, that ceremonial access does not alter blood. Amelia had pushed Charlotte and carried adult resentment down a hallway in her hands. Camilla argued that Amelia was being treated as toxic while Charlotte remained wrapped in rank and sympathy. William answered that his daughter's protection did not erase her responsibility, but that there was a deeper toxicity at work he refused to ignore. Adult anger that had been allowed to soak into the air around his children. Then came the line that sealed his decision. He set 2 fingers on the signed removal order and said, quietly but immovably, "This is staying exactly where it is." When Charles later reviewed the arrangements, he saw the problem instantly. Amelia's designation wasn't anchored to law. It was anchored to coordination with William's household. Overturning the removal would mean more than a father disagreeing with his son. It would mean the king publicly yanking control of his own grandchildren's environment out of their parents' hands. Everyone watching inside the palace understood that would be read as one thing: Charles taking Camilla's side against William on a matter that involved his children. Camilla understood the stakes before anyone explained them. She wanted to save Amelia from permanent embarrassment. She did not want to trigger a visible power struggle that would live on long after the corridor fight had faded. And in the middle of all of that, Amelia herself was reaching a conclusion nobody could reach for her. When Camilla told her the title was gone for good, Amelia stopped insisting she'd been misunderstood and asked the question that had been haunting her: had the king chosen Charlotte over her? The answer was both yes and no, and that's exactly why it hurt. Yes, in the sense that an institutional boundary had been drawn around the princess and not her. No, in the sense that Amelia was not being thrown out of the family. She was being removed from a circle she had entered through privilege, not birth. For the first time, she understood how precarious her place had always been. She belonged enough to be invited. She did not belong enough to be guaranteed. Standing near the crown is intoxicating until you discover that your access hinges on other people's restraint. When adult restraint breaks, the first thing that goes missing is your certainty. Camilla felt that accusation like a physical weight. She didn't try to talk Amelia out of it. Instead, she admitted that the adults had failed, that words from Clarence House had been allowed to reach ears they were never meant for. And during a private conversation recorded later, Amelia finally said the thing that stripped away Camilla's last defense. She admitted that when Charlotte told her, "That isn't what my father said," she realized the rumor might have been exaggerated. She pushed anyway. That moment of admitted choice turned every argument about fairness on its head. Camilla could fight for a misled girl. She could not pretend Amelia had had no agency once doubt arrived, and she decided to act regardless. The ceremonial pin went into the drawer. The designation died quietly, with no public announcement. But Amelia wasn't done facing what she'd done. She asked for something that no title could give her, and no title could replace. A chance to apologize to Charlotte herself, without adults running interference, without kings or queens or future kings holding the room. Catherine agreed on one condition, that the apology not travel through intermediaries. Charlotte wanted to hear Amelia directly. William agreed on one condition of his own, that reconciliation not automatically reverse consequence. He was not going to confuse peace with pretending nothing had happened. In that room, with Catherine outside the door and Camilla deliberately away, Amelia and Charlotte built the real ending to the story the adults had been trying to manage for weeks. Amelia said what no statement could say. She apologized for the shove and the rumor, and then admitted the emotional engine behind it. She had wanted the distorted story about William to be true, because it matched what she already feared, that he was silently clearing space his children would one day occupy without her, and that Charlotte represented that future in a body and a name and a smile she could see. She admitted that jealousy had made the rumor feel believable long before she had any evidence, and that anger at William had turned into punishment for Charlotte. Charlotte, in turn, didn't claim sainthood. She repeated the line she'd thrown, "A borrowed palace title doesn't make you royal," and said she regretted it even before the argument turned physical. That humility mattered, because it meant neither girl was allowed to pretend the other had carried all the blame. When Amelia finally said, "I was angry at your father, so I made you pay for it," she named the exact mechanism that had turned a queen's frustration into a shove in a hallway. Charlotte answered that that was the part that hurt, being made to pay for someone else's rage at someone else's choices. That mutual recognition didn't erase what had happened, but it stopped the fight neither of them had known how to end before. Outside that room, the institution was already adjusting. At the next engagement, Amelia's absence was so obvious that cameras didn't need a caption to tell the story. One photograph caught more than the lineup: William leaving with Charlotte's hand in his, and Camilla walking several steps behind them, her face calm but stripped of the warmth that usually helps her float through hostile coverage. Without anybody saying a word, the image made its own argument about where boundaries now lay. The palace released a narrow statement. Amelia no longer held the honorary young royal companion designation, a ceremonial role that allowed her to appear at selected family events, but did not make her a constitutional member of the monarchy. No explanation, no corridor details, no names of aides, no mention of Clarence House. That silence protected both girls. It also invited every commentator with a microphone to start filling in the blanks. Analysts framed the episode as William's clearest line-drawing moment so far, evidence that he intends to actively control the culture around the next generation of royals instead of simply inheriting whatever his father leaves. Talk shows asked whether this was William's first true test as future king. Headlines used phrases like "family divided" and "line drawn" because subtlety doesn't sell papers. Inside the palace, something different was taking shape. Charles warned his staff that protecting Charlotte did not mean sacrificing Amelia, and William told his team that no one was to brief against Camilla's granddaughter, even off the record. The institution had imposed a consequence. It would not weaponize it publicly. That choice, not to exploit a media-friendly villain, is almost as important as the removal order itself. William could have leaned into the narrative: father of the nation protects abused daughter, pushes out toxic influence, takes his rightful place as moral center. He didn't. He refused to turn the corridor into a podium. The deeper shift happened in conversations nobody saw. Charles closed the internal review and accepted the aide's resignation. Amelia kept attending strictly private family meals, stripped of her pin but not of her place. Camilla met William alone and admitted the line from Clarence House shouldn't have escaped that room. William admitted his own language about limits had landed colder than he'd intended. Neither apologized for defending their households. Both acknowledged that letting distrust boil without naming it had been what allowed a queen's remark to become a teenage shove. Days later, at a quiet lunch, Amelia asked whether she could sit next to Charlotte. The princess moved her chair slightly and made space. No cameras, no speeches, no royal correspondent standing outside to describe the hug that never happened. Just two girls choosing not to keep a war going that had never really belonged to them. William saw them talking and looked across the room at Camilla. She gave him a small nod. He returned it. The title stayed gone. The consequence stayed intact. The apology stayed real. The feud did not. In the end, what happened at Windsor wasn't just a reunion that split the family down the middle. It was something more precise. A moment when the crown used its power to draw a hard line, and then chose humility to make sure that line didn't become the first brick in a new wall between the next generation. William discovered that authority matters most when he knows exactly where to stop. Camilla discovered that love for a granddaughter sometimes means accepting that a lost privilege shouldn't be returned. Charles discovered that protecting the institution sometimes requires trusting his heir's instinct with his own grandchildren. Charlotte discovered that being defended doesn't free her from examining her own words. Amelia discovered that belonging near the crown is not a right, and that the apology that saved her relationships would mean less if the symbol she lost came back too easily. And the rest of us got a rare, unvarnished look at how power actually moves behind closed doors. Not in grand constitutional crises, but in those small, terrifying moments when adult sentences escape the room they were meant to die in, and land, with full force, on children who never should have heard them at all.